April 1945, outskirts of Berlin, Germany. When the troops retreated, they left behind not just weapons and ruins, but also invisible people, prisoners, women, children. Among them was Keiko, who at 22 years old had learned that surviving meant obeying and staying silent. But when the Allied tanks appeared on the horizon, a new dilemma began. Would it be liberation or just another type of captivity? Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we reopen forgotten stories. The morning air carried the acrid smell of gunpowder and burning wood as Keiko pressed herself against the concrete wall of the makeshift barracks. Through the cracked window, she could see German soldiers frantically loading trucks with documents, their faces etched with panic she had never witnessed before. For 3 years, these same men had moved with mechanical precision, their authority absolute and unquestionable. Now their hands shook as they destroyed evidence of what had transpired within these walls. The sound of approaching engines grew louder, different from the familiar rumble of German machinery. These engines carried a rougher, more powerful note. American Shermans, she realized, though she had only heard descriptions from other prisoners. Beside her, Michiko gripped her arm with trembling fingers, her eyes reflecting the same mixture of terror and impossible hope that Keiko felt burning in her chest. "What will they do to us?" Michiko whispered in Japanese, the first words either had dared speak above a whisper in days. The German guards had been increasingly volatile as news of Allied advances reached them, their cruelty sharpened by desperation and fear of what awaited them after defeat. Keiko had no answer. In her mind, soldiers were soldiers, men who took what they wanted from women who had no power to refuse. The nationality of the uniform seemed irrelevant when you had learned that your body was not your own, that survival meant disconnecting your mind from whatever was happening to your flesh. She had been transported from occupied Korea to this place outside Berlin along with dozens of other young women, promised work in factories but delivered into a nightmare that had no name she was allowed to speak. The sound of boots on concrete echoed through the corridor, but these footsteps were different too, heavier, more deliberate. German voices barked final orders before fading into the distance, replaced by unfamiliar words in a language she recognized as English from her brief schooling before the war changed everything. Through the thin walls, she could hear other women crying, some from relief, others from pure terror of the unknown. What did American soldiers want with Asian women found in German facilities? Would they simply continue what the Germans had started, or would there be some other fate awaiting them? The door to their room opened slowly, and instead of the harsh fluorescent light they expected, natural sunlight streamed in, the first real sunlight they had seen in months. A tall soldier stood silhouetted in the doorway, his rifle lowered, his posture somehow less threatening than any armed man they had encountered in years. "Ladies," he said in broken German, then switched to English, "You're safe now. We're Americans. We're here to help." Keiko understood enough English to grasp the words, but their meaning seemed impossible to process. Safe, help. These were concepts that had been systematically stripped from their reality, words that belonged to a world that existed before uniforms and commands, and the steady erosion of everything that had once made them human. The soldier, she could see now that he was young, perhaps not much older than herself, slowly removed his helmet and set it on the ground. His eyes held something she had almost forgotten existed, genuine concern. Not the calculating assessment of what could be taken, but actual worry for their well-being. As more American soldiers appeared behind him, Keiko noticed they carried medical supplies, blankets, and what appeared to be food rations. No weapons were raised, no orders barked. Instead, a medic approached slowly, his hands visible, speaking in gentle tones that somehow transcended the language barrier. For the first time in 3 years, Keiko allowed herself to consider that perhaps, just perhaps, the war might actually be over for them. The American field hospital had been established in what once served as a German officer's quarters, its sterile efficiency a stark contrast to the squalid conditions Keiko and the other women had endured for so long. Clean white sheets, actual beds instead of straw mattresses on concrete floors, and nurses who approached them with medical instruments rather than demands. It all felt surreal, like glimpsing a life that belonged to someone else entirely. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a field surgeon from Ohio, had volunteered to oversee the care of the liberated women. She moved between the beds with practiced efficiency, but Keiko noticed how she always announced her presence before touching anyone. how she explained each medical procedure in simple English, even when she wasn't sure if the patients understood. These small gestures of respect seemed revolutionary after years of being treated as objects rather than people. Infection, Dr. Mitchell explained to Keiko, pointing to the angry red marks on her wrists where shackles had rubbed the skin raw. We need to clean and treat these properly. She held up antiseptic and bandages, waiting for Keiko's nod of permission before proceeding, another impossibility that somehow was becoming reality. Through the translator, a Japanese-American soldier named Sergeant Tanaka, who had been called in from another unit, the women learned that they would not be immediately sent anywhere. They would remain here until they were strong enough to travel, until plans could be made for their future. No one spoke of what that future might hold. The concept seemed too vast and uncertain to contemplate after years of having no future beyond the next day's survival. It was Sergeant Tanaka who first asked the question that would change everything. What did you do before the war? The inquiry seemed so foreign that several women simply stared at him blankly. Before the war felt like another lifetime, a different universe where they had been people with names and dreams and skills that mattered. Slowly, hesitantly, answers began to emerge. Michiko had been a seamstress in Seoul. Yuki had worked in her family's textile shop. Hanako had learned embroidery from her grandmother, intricate patterns that told stories of seasons and celebrations. Sewing, Dr. Mitchell repeated when Sergeant Tanaka translated. Something shifted in her expression, a look of understanding followed by what appeared to be determination. Many of them know how to sew. That evening, as Keiko lay on clean sheets listening to the unfamiliar sound of safety, no footsteps in the corridors, no doors slamming, no shouted commands, she overheard Dr. Mitchell speaking urgently with other officers. The words were too fast and complex for her limited English, but she caught fragments: rehabilitation, dignity, purposeful work, healing. The next morning brought the first surprise. Instead of the usual medical rounds, soldiers arrived carrying wooden crates marked with American military stamps. They set the crates down gently in the center of the ward and began opening them with the careful attention usually reserved for valuable equipment. Inside the first crate, nestled in protective packaging, was a sewing machine. Not the industrial monsters they remembered from forced labor, but a compact, well-maintained Singer machine that gleamed under the hospital lights. Then another crate yielded scissors, measuring tapes, pins, and an array of fabric in colors they had almost forgotten existed. Blues like summer sky, yellows like sunlight, reds like the flowers that bloomed in gardens they remembered from childhood. "We thought," Dr. Mitchell said through Sergeant Tanaka, "that you might want to make something, for yourselves, whatever you want to make." The silence that followed was profound. Keiko stared at the sewing machine as if it might vanish if she looked away. When was the last time someone had asked what she wanted? When had anyone cared about her desires rather than their own? Slowly, Michiko approached the machine. Her fingers, still bearing the calluses and scars of forced labor, traced the smooth metal surface with something approaching reverence. She sat down at the bench, placed her feet on the pedals, and for the first time in years chose to begin something rather than being commanded to complete it. Now, we invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested in knowing how far and at what moments of day or night these documented accounts reach. The sewing machine's gentle rhythm became the soundtrack of healing. What had started with one woman hesitantly testing the pedals had transformed into something resembling a small workshop, though one unlike any that had existed during the war. Here, no quotas hung over their heads, no supervisors monitored their speed, and most remarkably, they could choose what to create. Keiko found herself drawn to making small pouches, delicate fabric containers no larger than her palm. She embroidered them with cherry blossoms, the pink thread creating petals that seemed to dance across the navy fabric she had chosen. When Sergeant Tanaka asked her about them, she struggled to explain in her limited English that these pouches were for carrying memories, small objects that would remind her of home, of who she had been before the war rewrote her entire existence. The American soldiers had initially maintained a respectful distance, unsure how to interact with women who flinched at sudden movements and fell silent when men entered the room. But the sewing machines had created an unexpected bridge. Sergeant Johnson, a farm boy from Iowa, mentioned that his shirt had lost a button, and Yuki had quietly gestured for him to bring it to her. As she attached a new button with precise practice stitches, he shared stories of his mother's sewing circle back home, how women would gather to mend and create while sharing news and gossip. Dr. Mitchell documented everything, not for military reports but for her own understanding of what she was witnessing. Occupational therapy, she wrote in her private journal, but more than that, they're reclaiming agency. Every stitch is a choice they make, every pattern a statement of who they are beyond what was done to them. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. Conversations began to emerge in whispered Japanese, then gradually in broken English as some of the women grew more comfortable. They shared techniques, comparing the stitching styles they had learned in different regions of Korea and Japan. Hanako demonstrated the intricate embroidery patterns her grandmother had taught her, while Michiko showed others how to create perfectly straight seams, even on difficult fabrics. Lieutenant Williams, the unit's quartermaster, had initially questioned the expense of providing sewing supplies to civilians. But when he saw what the women were producing, beautifully crafted items that demonstrated skill and artistry, rather than the crude functionality demanded by wartime production, he began to understand something his military training had not prepared him for. These women were not just survivors to be processed and relocated. They were craftspeople, artists, human beings with talents that war had temporarily buried, but not destroyed. The breakthrough came when Keiko approached Dr. Mitchell with a small wrapped bundle. Inside was a carefully sewn medical bag, compact but with multiple pockets, designed to hold instruments and supplies. The stitching was flawless, the design both practical and elegant. Attached was a note written in careful English. "Thank you for treating us like people. This is for your work helping others remember they are people too." Dr. Mitchell later wrote that she had to excuse herself from the ward for several minutes to compose herself. The gift represented more than gratitude. It was an assertion of identity, a declaration that the woman who created it possessed skills and dignity that no amount of brutality could permanently erase. Word of the sewing project spread through the Allied command structure, reaching officers who had been grappling with questions of how to handle the thousands of displaced persons the war was leaving in its wake. Here was an approach that went beyond mere survival to address something more fundamental: the reconstruction of human dignity through purposeful work, chosen rather than imposed. Other liberated women began to arrive at the facility, transported from other German installations as Allied forces continued their advance. Each new arrival brought different skills: weaving, knitting, fabric dyeing techniques that added new dimensions to what was becoming less a medical ward and more a workshop of renewal. The sewing machines multiplied as well. Supply officers, perhaps moved by reports of the project's success, began locating additional equipment. Some machines arrived with notes from American women's organizations, donated specifically for our sisters overseas who are rebuilding their lives. The solidarity across oceans and cultures, mediated through the universal language of craft and creation, added another layer to the healing taking place. As April gave way to May and news of Germany's surrender reached them, the women faced new uncertainties about their future. But now they faced these uncertainties while wearing clothes they had made for themselves, carrying personal items in pouches they had sewn, surrounded by evidence that they possessed valuable skills, and more importantly, that they remained the authors of their own stories. The news of Germany's unconditional surrender arrived on May 8th with a mixture of celebration and profound uncertainty. For the American soldiers, it meant the European war was over, and they could begin thinking about home. For Keiko and the other women, victory brought a question that was both liberating and terrifying. What came next? Representatives from various organizations had begun arriving at the facility, officials from the newly forming United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, delegates from the International Red Cross, and counselors trained to help displaced persons navigate their options for repatriation or resettlement. Each meeting brought forms to fill out, questions about family members who might still be alive, and decisions that felt impossibly weighty after years of having no choices at all. "Do you want to return to Korea?" the UNRWA representative asked through Sergeant Tanaka's translation. The question hung in the air like something fragile that might shatter if handled incorrectly. Korea was still occupied, still controlled by military forces, though now divided between Soviet and American zones. It was home, but it was not the home they remembered from before the war reshaped everything. Michiko was the first to voice what many were thinking. What if no one there remembers who we were before? What if they only see what was done to us? The stigma was unspoken but understood by everyone in the room. In traditional Korean society, women who had been forced into sexual slavery often faced rejection by their own families and communities, branded as permanently dishonored, regardless of the circumstances that had led to their situation. The shame was supposed to be theirs to carry, even though they had been victims rather than volunteers. Dr. Mitchell had been researching options with a determination that surprised even herself. She had contacted women's organizations in the United States, written to colleges that might provide educational opportunities, and explored possibilities for the women to continue their craft work in settings where their skills would be valued rather than their past scrutinized. There's a textile company in North Carolina, she explained during one evening session, owned by a woman whose son was killed in the Pacific. She's specifically interested in hiring skilled seamstresses, and she's offering to sponsor immigration visas. She says she wants to honor her son's memory by helping the women he was fighting to free. The offer seemed almost too generous to believe. America, a country they knew mainly through the kindness of the soldiers who had liberated them and the supplies that had enabled their recovery. Could they really build new lives in a place so foreign, speaking a language they barely knew? Other opportunities were emerging as well. A group of churches in Canada had organized a sponsorship program. Australia was accepting skilled immigrants to help rebuild its textile industry after wartime disruptions. Even some European countries, despite their own massive reconstruction needs, were offering opportunities for women with valuable trade skills. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Several American soldiers had written home about the women and their remarkable sewing work. Letters from wives and mothers began arriving, some containing offers of sponsorship, others simply expressing solidarity and admiration. Sergeant Johnson's mother sent fabric and patterns, along with a letter saying she would be honored to help any of the women establish themselves in Iowa if they were interested in farming communities. The choice that ultimately crystallized wasn't about geography but about autonomy. Whatever they decided, it would be their decision, made based on their own assessment of where they could best rebuild their lives. The sewing machines had given them more than a skill. They had provided evidence that they could create value through their own efforts, that they possessed agency in shaping their futures. Keiko spent hours at her machine, no longer making pouches for memories but crafting items for the unknown life ahead. She made sturdy work clothes, versatile pieces that could serve her well whether she ended up on a Canadian farm, in an American textile mill, or back in Korea, trying to restart a life interrupted by war. Each stitch was practice for independence, each completed garment proof that she could provide for herself, regardless of what circumstances awaited her. The American command had decided to maintain the facility through the summer, giving the women time to make informed decisions about their futures and to prepare practically for whatever paths they chose. The sewing project had evolved into something resembling a vocational school, with experienced seamstresses teaching more advanced techniques to those who wanted to pursue textile work professionally. If this case has already captured your attention, please leave a like. It helps the story of Keiko and the other women reach more people. By late summer 1945, the makeshift workshop had become something unprecedented in the chaos of post-war displacement, a place where women who had been systematically dehumanized were systematically reclaiming their humanity, one carefully chosen stitch at a time. The sewing machines that had initially seemed like such an unusual form of aid had proven to be instruments of transformation, more powerful than any medication or therapy session. Keiko made her decision on a September morning when the first autumn chill reminded her of changing seasons in Korea. She would accept the sponsorship offer from the textile company in North Carolina. The decision wasn't based on fear of returning home or attraction to American culture, but on a more fundamental calculation. She wanted to go somewhere her skills would be valued more than her history would be questioned. Dr. Mitchell helped her prepare the paperwork, a process that seemed miraculous in its assumption that Keiko had the right to choose her own destination. The visa application asked about her professional qualifications, and for the first time since before the war, she could list valuable skills that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with creation. Other women made different choices, each reflecting their individual assessments of where they could best rebuild interrupted lives. Michiko decided to return to Korea, armed with advanced sewing techniques and a small collection of American fabrics that she planned to use in establishing her own shop. Yuki accepted sponsorship from a Canadian church group, drawn by their promise to help her pursue education while working part-time in their community textile cooperative. The farewells were complicated by emotions that had no simple names. These women had shared the worst experiences imaginable, but they had also shared the remarkable process of recovery. They had witnessed each other transform from victims who flinched at shadows into craftswomen who approached sewing machines with confidence and purpose. Dr. Mitchell presented each departing woman with a professional sewing kit, high-quality scissors, measuring tapes, pins, and thread in a leather case that would travel well and last for years. But the most significant gift was a letter of recommendation detailing their skills and work ethic, written in medical terminology that carried weight with immigration officials and potential employers. "You are talented seamstresses," she wrote in each letter. "With exceptional attention to detail and remarkable resilience, any organization would be fortunate to benefit from your skills and dedication." The letters made no mention of how these skills had been discovered or the circumstances that had led to their displacement. In Dr. Mitchell's carefully chosen words, they were simply skilled professionals seeking opportunities to contribute their talents. Keiko's journey to America began in October, traveling with 2 other women who had accepted similar sponsorships. The ocean voyage that once might have terrified women who associated ship travel with forced transportation had become something different, a chosen passage to a life they would build through their own efforts. The textile mill in North Carolina proved to be everything the correspondence had promised. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, the owner whose son had died at Iwo Jima, had prepared housing, arranged English classes, and created work schedules that allowed the women to develop their skills while earning living wages. More importantly, she had prepared her existing employees for the arrival of women who might need patience and kindness as they adjusted to new surroundings. Keiko's first paycheck, money earned through work she had chosen to do, felt as revolutionary as liberation itself. She deposited most of it in the bank account Mrs. Thompson had helped her establish, but she spent a small portion on fabric and thread to continue sewing in her spare time. The items she made now were different: tablecloths for the small apartment she rented, curtains that transformed institutional housing into something resembling home, and occasionally gifts for the American women who had welcomed her into their community. The letters that arrived from other survivors scattered across continents told similar stories of gradual rebuilding. Michiko had indeed established her shop in Seoul and was training other women in advanced techniques. Yuki was excelling in her studies while contributing to her Canadian community's textile production. Each letter included small fabric samples, a tradition they had started to maintain connections across the distances their separate choices had created. Dr. Mitchell, who had returned to Ohio after her military service, continued corresponding with many of the women. Her letters mixed personal news with updates about others in their group, creating a network of connection that spanned multiple countries and languages. She had also begun speaking about their experiences to medical conferences, not as case studies in trauma recovery, but as examples of how respect for human agency could facilitate healing in ways that traditional treatment approaches often missed. 5 years after liberation, Keiko received a package that made her cry for the first time since those early days in the field hospital. Inside was a wedding dress, not for her but created by Hanako, who had returned to Japan and was now running a high-end dressmaking business in Tokyo. The dress was a masterpiece of technical skill and artistic vision, but the accompanying note was even more precious. "For your niece's wedding," Hanako wrote, "from women who learned that we could choose to create beauty instead of just surviving ugliness. Thank you for following this story of resilience and renewal." Please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments about how ordinary objects, like sewing machines, can become instruments of extraordinary transformation. These documented accounts remind us that recovery often begins not with grand gestures but with simple opportunities to choose purpose over helplessness, creation over destruction, and hope over surrender. Asheville, North Carolina, October 2024. Keiko Nakamura Thompson sat in the textile museum that now bore her name, her weathered hands still steady as she demonstrated embroidery techniques to a group of young seamstresses. At 101 years old, she remained the museum's most active volunteer. arriving each morning with the same purposeful stride that had carried her through nearly 8 decades of chosen work. The museum itself was housed in the renovated building where she had first worked upon arriving in America in 1945. What had once been Eleanor Thompson's textile mill was now a memorial and educational center, telling the stories of displaced persons who had rebuilt their lives through skilled crafts. The centerpiece of the main exhibit was the original Singer sewing machine that Dr. Sarah Mitchell had first placed before a group of traumatized women in a German field hospital. The machine still works perfectly, Keiko told visitors in lightly accented English that carried traces of Korean, German, and Southern American inflections, the linguistic layers of a life lived across continents. Good machines, well cared for, last longer than the people who use them. This one has sewn thousands of pieces over the decades. The museum's archives contained correspondence from 47 women who had been part of that original group in 1945. Their letters, donated by families or the women themselves, created a tapestry of lives rebuilt across 6 continents. Michiko's descendants had established a textile scholarship fund in Seoul. Yuki's granddaughter was now a textile engineer in Vancouver. Hanako's Tokyo boutique had become internationally renowned for wedding dress designs that blended traditional Japanese techniques with contemporary aesthetics. Dr. Mitchell's personal papers, donated after her death in 1987, revealed the full scope of what she had understood intuitively during those months in Germany. The sewing machines were never about occupational therapy, she had written in a 1960 journal entry. They were about returning choice to people who had forgotten they had the right to choose. Every pattern they selected, every stitch they placed, was practice in autonomy. The museum's most powerful exhibit was a recreation of the original field hospital workshop, complete with the wooden crates, fabric samples, and even reproductions of the first simple items the women had sewn for themselves. Visitors often spent long minutes in contemplative silence in this space, perhaps recognizing something universal about the human need to create meaning through purposeful work. But it was the contemporary component of the museum that revealed the lasting impact of that long-ago experiment in dignity. The facility now hosted programs for modern refugees and trafficking survivors, offering not just sewing classes, but training in various skilled crafts. The underlying principle remained unchanged. Healing begins when people can choose to create rather than simply endure. Keiko's own apartment above the museum contained examples of her work from nearly every year since 1945, a visual autobiography stitched in fabric, wedding dresses for 3 generations of American friends, quilts that told stories of Korean seasons in North Carolina colors, business suits for professional women entering careers that hadn't existed when she first learned to sew, and always the small embroidered pouches she still made, now filled with photos, letters, and mementos of a full life chosen rather than imposed. The final display case in the museum held items that had arrived just the previous year, textiles created by women in modern conflict zones who had learned of the 1945 sewing machine project through academic research and social media. From Syria, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Ukraine came photographs of women who had established craft cooperatives as tools for psychological and economic recovery. The thread of human resilience, it seemed, could span both decades and continents. On this particular October afternoon, as autumn light streamed through windows she had helped design during the museum's construction, Keiko was visited by Dr. Jennifer Chen, a researcher studying post-conflict rehabilitation programs. Dr. Chen had traveled from Stanford University specifically to interview Keiko about the long-term impacts of what scholars now called the dignity through choice model of trauma recovery. What would you want people today to understand about what happened in 1945? Dr. Chen asked, her recorder capturing words that would become part of an academic archive. Keiko paused in her embroidery work, considering the question with the same careful attention she brought to placing each stitch. People think liberation means being saved by someone else, she finally replied, but real liberation means being given the tools and respect you need to save yourself. Those American soldiers didn't save us by giving us sewing machines. They saved us by trusting us to know what to do with them. She gestured toward the museum's main hall, where visitors of all ages were examining exhibits, some taking notes, others simply absorbing the visual testimony of lives rebuilt through determination and skill. Every person who comes here and learns this story goes out knowing something important, that human dignity isn't something that can be permanently destroyed, only temporarily buried, and that sometimes the most powerful form of resistance is simply choosing to create something beautiful. As evening approached and the museum prepared to close, Keiko completed the small embroidered piece she had been working on during the interview, a cherry blossom branch in pink thread against midnight blue fabric. Tomorrow she would present it to Dr. Chen as a gift, continuing a tradition of sharing beauty that had begun with a thank you gift to Dr. Mitchell nearly 8 decades earlier. The thread, as always, continued. Museum placard. Text: The Keiko Nakamura Thompson Museum of Resilience and Renewal is dedicated to all survivors who transform trauma into purpose and to all liberators who understand that true freedom means the right to choose your own path forward. Established 2010, Asheville, North Carolina. In memory of Dr. Sarah Mitchell, 1918-1987, who saw craftswomen when others saw only victims, and who proved that healing begins with respect.